As England stepped into the 14th century, a boy of only 14 took the throne, Edward III. The reign of this young king would not only reshape his kingdom, but change the fate of the continent. In 1327, following the deposition of his father Edward II, Edward III was proclaimed king while still a child. In the early years of his reign, power remained in the hands of his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. But within just a few years, the young king proved his competence. In 1330, he had Mortimer arrested in a night raid and took control of power himself. Edward's reign was not merely the rule of a king, but the formation of a new era. To glorify his dynasty, he set his sights not only on England, but also on the throne of France. Through his mother's Capetian bloodline, he found a legal foundation to claim the crown of France. This claim launched the 100 Years' War in 1337. England was no longer merely an island kingdom. It now stood at the centre of the European balance of power. Edward sanctified his victories on the battlefield with the culture of chivalry. The Order of the Garter, founded in 1348, became not only a symbol of loyalty, but also of knightly spirit dedicated to the English crown. In many ways, it was the Arthurian legend made flesh. By including Parliament in governance, he maintained a balance in his relations with the nobility. As Weir emphasises, Edward was not only a commanding king, but a consultative one. Parliament became a co-decision maker with the king in matters such as taxation and foreign policy. This marked a turning point in the constitutional development of England. Under Edward's rule, the monarchy began to function not merely as a royal institution, but as a socio-political network. The king expanded the foundation of public legitimacy by listening not only to lords, but also to merchants and town councils. In all these respects, the reign of Edward III was not merely a period of growth for England, it was a time when England became England. But the foundation of this grandeur rested on something far more fragile, the complexity of dynastic succession, and that complexity would give birth to civil war within a generation. In 1337, King Edward III of England made a decision that would alter the course of history. He claimed the French throne. His justification was his Capetian lineage through his mother Isabella, but the real issue lay elsewhere. According to the traditional succession laws of France under Salic law, inheritance could not pass through the female line. Still, Edward saw France's political weakness as an opportunity. Initially, his goal was to defend English-held territories, such as Gascony and Calais. But soon his ambitions grew. Now he wanted the French crown itself. England was prepared for war both politically and socially. Edward, as chroniclers later noted, was as much a master of propaganda as of warfare. Once he declared his claim, a chivalric mobilization spread throughout the kingdom. In 1340, he openly proclaimed himself King of France, and the English royal arms were redesigned to include not just the three lions, but also the French fleur-de-lis. In 1346, the English army landed in northern France. The objective, Crécy. In this battle, the longbowmen were the English army's greatest asset. It was not a war of noble knights, but of peasant archers. The English, vastly outnumbered, crushed the French. The longbows cut down the French cavalry. 10 years later, in 1356, a similar scene unfolded at Poitiers. This time, the French king Jean II himself was captured. Edward's son, the Black Prince, stepped onto the historical stage. His military skill marked him as the next star of the English royal line. This war was not merely a fight over a crown, it was the revival of old Plantagenet claims. The territories England held in France were also of crucial economic importance. Through the port of Calais, England's wool trade flowed into the heart of Europe. But the war opened not only foreign fronts, but domestic ones as well. In its early phase, England experienced economic growth. War spoils and expanding trade enriched the nobility and strengthened certain merchant cities. But the cost was steep, the constant increase in tax demands, growing social pressure on peasants, labour shortages, and agricultural decline. The burden of war was not shared equally. Edward was strong, but his kingdom was fragile. A chasm grew between the enriched aristocracy and the oppressed peasantry. And after every victory, more was needed. More money, more soldiers, more suffering. The victories at Crécy and Poitiers legitimised England's claim to France. But they also gave birth to a new England. The transition from chivalric to professional armies, the empowerment of nobles through warfare, and the slow shift of the economy toward urbanisation became inevitable. By the mid-14th century, the prolific family tree of Edward III revealed not strength, but vulnerability. Each of his sons, rewarded with their own county or duchy, began to build their own political centres. This created a new problem for England. One crown, too many power centres. Two major branches emerged from the sons of Edward during this period. John of Gaunt, Edward's third son, his descendants would form the House of Lancaster. His son, Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, would stand at the centre of a crisis of legitimacy. Edmund of Langley, the fifth son, his descendants would establish the House of York. His grandson Richard would later become the Yorkist claimant at the heart of the Wars of the Roses. Lineage was tangled, claims to the throne were complex, and inheritances were deeply entangled. In this system, it was not only the king who could be called an heir, many could claim the same right. In medieval England, the political system rested on a feudal balance in which the central authority relied on the power of the nobility. The king could not rule the country directly. Instead, he granted land, titles and autonomy to dukes and earls who were expected to be loyal. Over time, however, these nobles, especially great houses like Lancaster, York and Warwick, came to possess their own armies, revenues and networks of allegiance. Edward's system had, in effect, imperialised the nobility. In the north and west, powerful duchies began to resemble independent principalities. Edward believed that by giving his sons territories and honours, he was strengthening the realm. But in truth, every title he granted planted the seed of a future claim. This was a classic medieval problem. The more sons you have, the less loyalty you retain. The crown belongs to one person, but the dynasty is always crowded. And if that crowd thirsts for war, the kingdom is reduced to nothing more than a battlefield, and its noble lineages become the roots that bleed. Edward III's legacy was marked not only by war, but by the dynasty he left behind. 5 of his sons reached adulthood, and each one represented not only the prestige of the house, but the seeds of its collapse. Now let us meet his sons. The eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince. He was the people's favourite. Known as the Black Prince, not just for his dark armour, but for the shadow he cast over his enemies at Poitiers and Crécy. His skill in war evoked the golden age of chivalry. He was both his father's pride and the hero of the people, but he would never become king. In 1376, while his father was still alive, he died. He left behind a small child, Richard. That child would one day ascend the throne, but he would never emerge from the shadow of his grandfather or his father. Richard II inherited not his father's warrior spirit, but his loneliness. The third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. He was the third son, but his power was second to none. John of Gaunt became the de facto ruler of the realm as his father aged. He was the very image of aristocratic authority, a baron woven from land, wealth, and strategic marriage alliances. His estate stretched from Yorkshire to Gascony. He was the greatest lord in England. But his true strength lay in his son, Henry Bolingbroke. That son would one day defy Richard II, face exile, and return to take the crown. Henry IV would become the first king of the Lancastrian dynasty. The fifth son, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. He was Edward's fifth son. He was neither as warlike as the Black Prince nor as politically powerful as John of Gaunt, but his name would one day become the origin of a lineage that would bathe England in blood. In 1385, Edmund was granted the title of Duke of York. His house would carry not a martial legacy, but a historical claim. One of his sons, Richard, Duke of York, would go so far as to declare himself king. The Yorkist line would not base its claim on power, but on the right of ancestry. This dynastic claim would become not only a matter of blood, but a challenge to the very structure of constitutional authority. The youngest son, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. He was the last, but perhaps the most dangerous. Thomas of Woodstock, the youngest brother, became one of the fiercest opponents of Richard II's rule. He helped form a group in Parliament known as the Lords Appellant, who launched formal investigations against the king's favourites. But power does not remain loyal for long. In 1397, under Richard's orders, Thomas was arrested. Soon after, without even a formal trial, he was killed. It was a preview of the civil war to come. Edward III had granted his sons titles. Each received a castle, raised an army, built their own sphere of influence. But the throne belonged to only one, and as the claimants multiplied, loyalty diminished. In 1376, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, succumbed to an illness that had plagued him for years. Invincible in battle, he died weakened in bed. His father, Edward III, was still alive. The other sons were powerful, but they could not take the place of the eldest. Edward's son Richard was only 9 years old. In the English monarchy, the system of succession was based on primogeniture, the right of the eldest son and then his sons. But the problem was this: would the people accept a child king, or did they want a strong adult? Prince Richard was legally the heir, but the realm was forced to bear the weight of a boy. This showed that succession was not only a matter of legitimacy, but also of practicality. Then a new figure stepped into the scene: Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt, Edward's most powerful surviving son, Duke of Lancaster. He was not king in name, but in effect, he ruled the country. John of Gaunt held direct influence over taxation, foreign affairs, and court appointments. This situation sparked resentment both at court and among the people. It was during this period that England began for the first time to question whether the crown was a personal possession or a public trust. At this point, Edward III was old and ineffective. Richard was young and unprepared. And meanwhile, the nobles were gathering power. When Richard II came to the throne in 1377, after the death of his grandfather, he was only 10 years old. The crown had passed to him, but government, of course, did not. England at the time was governed by the House of Lords and the King's Circle of Advisers. But this was not a simple regency. It was a far more complicated balance. It was the first period in which the boundaries of constitutional monarchy were truly tested. There was a king, but he did not rule. There was a parliament, but it did not govern. There were advisers, but they were at war with one another. This power vacuum was felt not only in court, but also in the streets. In the summer of 1381, a revolt shook England, the Peasants' Revolt. Taxes had risen sharply, the agricultural system had collapsed after the plague, and for the first time the people marched directly toward their king. Led by Wat Tyler, thousands of rebels entered London. The young King Richard was only 14 years old, yet he faced the crowd with astonishing composure. With his words, he dispersed the masses, but Wat Tyler was suddenly killed. As Richard grew, he began to take power into his own hands. But the advisers he surrounded himself with, especially Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole, caused great unrest among the nobility. These figures were not only the king's friends, they held direct influence over the affairs of state, and this began to test the limits of the English aristocracy. This was no longer government through institutions, but through personal ties within the royal household. The aristocracy was pushed aside, Parliament lost its authority, and governance lost transparency. And revolt came not only from the people, but from within the nobility. In 1387, 5 major nobles came together and called themselves the Lords Appellant. Their aim was to remove the king's favourites from power and even bring some to trial. All of Richard's favourites were neutralised. Richard never forgot these events. In 1397, he regained absolute power. His first move was to take revenge on the members of the Lords Appellant who had once opposed him. Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, his own uncle, was arrested and killed. Figures like Arundel and Warwick were tried, executed, or exiled. Richard was no longer a child, but he was no longer a king either. He had become the executor of his own justice. Government no longer operated through Parliament, but through the loyalty of the court. This new order signalled the rise of an absolutist model. Richard II grew up on the throne, but as he grew, he became more and more isolated. He found no lasting support from the people, the nobles, or even his own family. He personalised his rule, and in the end he was punished personally. In 1398, John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, was exiled by King Richard II. But the following year, after his father's death, Henry's inheritance, the vast Lancaster estates, was confiscated. This was not only the theft of a nobleman's wealth, but of his honour. But, at that point, Richard had not just disobeyed custom, he had broken legal boundaries. The balance of aristocratic loyalty, upon which the English monarchy rested, was shattered. Henry returned, not just to reclaim his lands, but to take the throne. He arrived, he spoke, he gathered power, and he became king. Henry quickly won the support of both the people and the nobility. This support was not driven only by resentment, but also by hope, the hope of relief from Richard's oppressive rule. Henry was seen as the noble prince who would restore peace. Richard II was deposed without a major battle, and he was removed from the throne by Act of Parliament. His successor was not his son, but his cousin, a new branch of the royal house. For the first time in English history, a king had been deposed outside the legal framework of succession, and the one who took his place tried to justify his rule through force of circumstance. The principle of primogeniture, that the crown should pass to the eldest son or his heir, had collapsed. The throne was no longer a right, but something that could be seized. Henry was the first to depose a king and claim the crown for himself. But what mattered more was that those who came after him would see such an act as legitimate. This event changed the nature of power in England. A king no longer ruled solely by divine right. If he was weak in the eyes of the people, he could be removed. The crown was no longer a certainty, it had become a contested prize. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, seized the English throne. This development signified not only a change of monarch but also a challenge to the established system of succession. Henry deposed the legitimate king, Richard II, and took his place. This was the first time in English monarchical history that a king ascended not by divine right, but by direct political force. The accession of Henry IV triggered a long-term legitimacy crisis in English political culture. The throne was no longer seen as an inviolable birthright, but as a position that could be contested and claimed. This shift would lay the groundwork for internal conflicts in the years to come. Shortly after coming to power, Henry's relationship with one of his main supporters, the Percy family, began to deteriorate. The Earl of Northumberland and his son Henry Hotspur Percy had initially supported Henry's claim to the throne. However, Hotspur did not receive the political and financial rewards he had expected. By 1403, the dispute escalated into open rebellion. At the Battle of Shrewsbury, Hotspur's rebel forces clashed with Henry IV's army. The battle ended in a royal victory, and Hotspur was killed in combat. While this brought short-term stability for Henry, it also exposed the danger posed by former allies who could turn into serious threats. Around the same time, another major threat emerged in the west. In 1400, Owain Glyndŵr, a Welsh landowner and lawyer, declared himself Prince of Wales and launched an armed movement for independence. His cause gained significant support from both the local aristocracy and the general population. Several regions of Wales effectively broke away from English control, and by 1404, Glyndŵr had secured an alliance with France, expanding the rebellion. Henry IV struggled to suppress the uprising. The English army was unable to operate effectively in Wales due to both difficult geography and strong local resistance. The revolt evolved into a prolonged internal security crisis that drained both the military and financial resources of the crown. In the following years, Henry IV's health deteriorated significantly. He suffered from skin conditions, seizures, and periods of unconsciousness, which frequently removed him from direct governance. As a result, his son, Prince Henry, began to take on more responsibility. This created a de facto dual leadership at court. Prince Henry became increasingly prominent in the public eye, especially for his role in managing domestic unrest. The king's illness led not only to physical weakness, but also to political isolation. He lost influence within the court, his support network weakened, and his ability to govern diminished. In 1413, Henry IV died. His son, now Henry V, emerged as a strong, energetic, and stabilizing figure in the eyes of the English public. The reign of Henry IV demonstrated that a throne taken by force could struggle to produce lasting stability. In 1413, following the death of Henry IV, Prince Henry ascended to the English throne. His succession was welcomed by a public eager for stability after years of uncertainty surrounding the legitimacy of the previous reign. Henry V was seen not only as a new monarch but also as a restorer of order. In contrast to his father's rule, marked by illness and rebellion, the young king entered power with broad support from both the church and the nobility. Upon his accession, Henry immediately took steps to restore internal order. He imposed harsh measures against the Lollard movement, reinforcing his alliance with the church and affirming his commitment to suppressing radical religious factions. This decisive stance established his image as a strong and authoritative ruler in the eyes of the population. However, Henry V's primary focus was foreign policy. Following the path of his grandfather, Edward III, he revived England's claim to the French throne. In Henry's view, the territorial losses and declining influence from earlier phases of the 100 Years' War needed to be reversed. In 1415, he launched a military campaign in France. In October 1415, the Battle of Agincourt took place. The English army, though vastly outnumbered, won a significant victory against the French cavalry on muddy terrain. English longbowmen dealt a serious blow to the traditional feudal structure of the French army. The battle was considered a turning point not only in military terms, but also ideologically. It elevated Henry's personal image into a national symbol. Agincourt was not just a military victory, it was also a political one. The triumph increased the number of French nobles willing to cooperate with England and laid the groundwork for further diplomatic efforts. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, was the outcome of these developments. Under the treaty, King Charles VI of France recognized Henry as his son-in-law and heir to the French throne. With this agreement, Henry obtained a formal claim to succeed the French crown. As part of the treaty, Henry married Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI. The marriage was considered a major step toward uniting the English and French royal houses. However, the enforceability of the agreement was highly uncertain. France was politically unstable, and Charles VI's mental health was deteriorating. Despite these difficulties, Henry continued his campaign in France. In 1422, Henry V fell ill, likely suffering from dysentery or typhoid contracted during the campaign. He died at the age of 35. A few months later, Charles VI of France also died. As a result, Henry's infant son, now Henry VI, was declared King of both England and France. This succession, however, would later trigger a series of political crises. Despite the short length of his reign, Henry V left a lasting legacy in England, marked by military success, political stability, and dynastic prestige. With Henry V's death in 1422, the English crown passed to his one-year-old son, Henry VI. That same year, King Charles VI of France also died, making the infant Henry king of both realms. In practice, however, he was too young to comprehend the weight of kingship or to govern two kingdoms. This ushered in a long regency period in England. Although the crown legally belonged to Henry VI, real power was shared among royal councils and noble families. This period became a transitional regime where the absence of a ruling monarch weakened central authority. The king's minority created an opening for factional rivalries at court and disarray in foreign policy. England's claims in France became increasingly untenable without strong leadership. During this time, England's military position in France deteriorated. In 1429, during the Siege of Orléans, a new figure emerged on the French side, Joan of Arc. Her arrival altered the psychological trajectory of the war. Joan's leadership boosted French morale and halted the momentum of the English advance. That same year, Charles, recognized by many as the legitimate heir, was crowned in Reims. This effectively nullified the Treaty of Troyes and the political gains achieved under Henry V. Meanwhile, domestic politics in England became increasingly complex. In 1437, Henry VI turned 16 and formally assumed royal authority. Yet, as many contemporaries observed, he wore the crown but did not rule. Henry was personally peaceful, devout, and conciliatory. However, in a country emerging from war, such traits were interpreted as signs of weakness. The king struggled to make political decisions and increasingly relied on his advisors. In 1445, Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou, a French noblewoman. The marriage was part of a broader peace effort and the result of ongoing negotiations with the French crown. However, in order to secure peace, England conceded significant ground. Most notably, a secret agreement to cede the province of Maine to France sparked public outrage in England and drew heavy criticism from the nobility. Margaret entered the royal court not merely as a queen consort, but as a factional leader, and she quickly gained considerable influence over the king. During this period, figures such as William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, rose to political prominence. Suffolk was widely viewed as the architect of failed foreign policy, while Somerset became increasingly associated with military defeats in France. Their rapid rise disturbed many powerful nobles outside the immediate circle of the royal household and deepened political polarization within the realm. Among the most vocal opponents was Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the king's uncle and longtime chief advisor. Gloucester openly resisted the growing influence of Margaret's faction and their allies. However, in 1447, he was removed by Suffolk's camp, arrested, and shortly thereafter died in custody without ever facing trial. This was seen not merely as the elimination of one man, but as the dismantling of what remained of the traditional parliamentary balance. From that point onward, Henry VI's rule came increasingly under the control of Margaret and her associates. At the same time, the king's mental health began to deteriorate. By the late 1440s, he was frequently unresponsive, unable to make decisions, and increasingly withdrawn from those around him. Even before his full mental breakdown in 1453, the English crown had already become functionally paralyzed. This was not just the collapse of a monarch's mind, but, as some observers described it, the mental collapse of the institution itself. The king's disengagement from governance created a power vacuum among the nobility. That vacuum would soon escalate into armed conflict. Henry VI's mental breakdown was not only a personal tragedy, but also the direct political crisis that laid the foundation for the Wars of the Roses. In the summer of 1453, England received devastating news: the fall of Bordeaux. This was not merely the loss of a city, it marked the end of England's last major holding in France after more than a century of war. With Bordeaux gone, the 100 Years' War was effectively over, and for England, it had ended in failure. But this was more than a political defeat. For King Henry VI, the loss of Bordeaux triggered a psychological collapse. In August, he suddenly withdrew into himself, ceased speaking, and stopped responding to those around him. He entered what contemporaries described as a state of living without awareness, silent, immobile, unresponsive. He remained in this condition for nearly a year. He gave no orders, issued no decisions, and displayed no awareness of his surroundings. By all accounts, he was alive, but not ruling. Modern historians have speculated that the episode may have been a form of catatonic schizophrenia or a severe depressive break. Of course, no such diagnosis existed in the 15th century, but politically the implications were clear. England had no king in any functional sense. Henry's madness was not merely a health crisis, it was a constitutional one. In England, the monarch was not just a symbolic figurehead, but an active centre of governance. Now, with the rightful king unconscious and incapable of rule, the machinery of government faced paralysis. At this critical moment, attention turned to a figure who had long been sidelined, Richard, Duke of York. York had spent the last year in political retreat at Kenilworth, having been pushed aside after the failed uprising at Dartford in 1452. But now circumstances had changed. The king was incapacitated, Queen Margaret was pregnant, and the government remained in the hands of controversial figures like Somerset. The political nation was clearly in search of a new stabilising force. York's return to the political stage was, in many ways, a reluctant but necessary solution. In November 1453, he was formally summoned to court. However, he was not immediately granted authority. Instead, attention turned to Queen Margaret, who gave birth to a son, Edward, born at Westminster, and proclaimed heir to the throne. The timing of this birth was significant. It appeared to be a calculated effort to weaken York's potential claim to the crown. Yet the king remained incapacitated and the kingdom could not function in his absence. In March 1454, York was officially named Lord Protector of the realm. This was a temporary position, akin to a prime ministership. He would govern in the king's name, but his authority would cease if and when the king recovered. This appointment temporarily restructured the balance of power in England. During his protectorship, York allied himself with powerful nobles such as the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick. Parliament was reactivated. Fiscal discipline was restored. According to contemporary observers, this brief period of governance gave rise to what some called an order without a crown. There was no king, but at least there was stability. York's rise, however, also triggered growing anxiety among his rivals. Chief among them was Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Previously protected by Margaret and the king, Somerset now found himself stripped of power. By the end of 1454, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. This was not merely a political setback for Somerset, it was, as many contemporaries saw it, a death sentence in disguise. York and his circle held him responsible for England's military failures in France and the internal corruption of the royal court. Meanwhile, Henry VI began to show signs of recovery. Toward the end of 1454, he recognised his son, spoke for the first time in months, and gave his assent to several royal decisions. By early 1455, he had improved to the point where his protectorship was deemed no longer necessary. Margaret moved quickly. She declared the king restored and saw to it that Somerset was released. But York refused to step aside. For him and his allies, Somerset's return to power was unacceptable. What had begun as a political dispute was now becoming something far more dangerous, an armed confrontation between factions. In May 1455, Richard of York, along with the Earls of Warwick and Salisbury, gathered their forces. Their opponents, Somerset, Northumberland and Clifford, stood at the king's side. Margaret of Anjou had successfully restored her faction to royal prominence, but trust between the two sides had completely collapsed. Within weeks, the political standoff would erupt into open conflict. England now stood on the brink of civil war. By the spring of that year, the country was effectively divided. On one side stood the Duke of York, backed by his powerful northern allies, proclaiming a mission of national reform. On the other, the royal court had once again fallen under the control of Margaret's inner circle, with Somerset and his allies at its centre. Although Henry VI had recovered from his mental collapse, he remained passive, a symbolic figure. The true struggle was now between those who ruled in his name. In early May, Henry's government summoned a great council to convene in the town of St. Albans. On the surface, it appeared to be an attempt at reconciliation, but for York, it was a trap. Somerset had been released from custody and appeared to be regaining control over the king's decisions. For York, this posed a direct threat, not just to his own safety, but to the balance of power in the kingdom. He interpreted the summons as a chance to reclaim the king and settle the score with Somerset once and for all. The York, Warwick and Salisbury marched south swiftly. The exact size of their army is unknown, but estimates place Yorkist forces between 3,000 and 5,000 men, roughly equal to the king's supporters. Still, this was not a battle defined by size, but by symbolism and strategy. York maintained that he opposed not the king, but those who surrounded him. Yet conflict was now unavoidable. On the morning of May 22nd, Yorkist troops arrived just outside the town of St. Albans. It was a modest but strategically placed town, close to London and situated at a key intersection of roads. Crucially, the king himself was present. Henry VI had taken up residence in an inn in the town centre, accompanied by Somerset, Northumberland, and Clifford. York initially sought negotiation. He sent envoys demanding the surrender of Somerset. Despite being surrounded, the king refused. As Alison Weir notes, this was the moment when Henry abandoned neutrality and fully aligned himself with his faction. York's plan had been to carry out a quick and targeted assault, seizing Somerset without broader bloodshed. But the town was fortified. Its narrow streets and closely packed houses favoured the defenders. The Royalist side had positioned archers in windows, and the initial Yorkist assault, led by Warwick, was repelled. According to some reports, even local townspeople aided in resisting the attack. At this point, the battle took a decisive turn. Warwick extended the attack from the east, catching the defenders off guard. According to several accounts, this manoeuvre breached the town's perimeter at an unexpected point. Yorkist troops began filtering into the streets through alleyways and side entrances. The fighting lasted no more than 30 minutes, but it was devastating. As Warwick's men pushed into the market square, the king's guards broke ranks. Somerset attempted to flee the upper floor of the inn, but was intercepted by Yorkist soldiers. Though some sources claim he tried to surrender, he was killed on the spot. According to certain chroniclers, he was hacked to death, a scene less like a battle and more like an execution. Both Clifford and Northumberland were also killed that day. King Henry VI was found sheltering in a corner house. When York and Warwick approached, the king reportedly recognised them and told them they could kill him if they wished. But this was symbolic. York had no intention, yet, of harming the king. Instead, they placed him under their protection. Still, the question of who was protecting whom now hung in the air. Militarily, the engagement had been minor. Politically, it was seismic. St. Albans marked the official beginning of the Wars of the Roses. For the first time, a royal army had been defeated by a rival noble faction. For the first time, internal court rivalries had spilled into open warfare. And for the first time, a dynastic dispute had become, in the public eye, a national crisis. This moment can best be described as the point at which personal vendettas transformed into political ideology. York was no longer simply opposing corrupt advisors, he was challenging the very structure of royal governance. For Margaret of Anjou, the defeat was devastating. Her husband had failed to assert power, and her most loyal supporters had been killed. From this point on, she would no longer act through the king. she would act for herself. In 1455, the Battle of St Albans ended, at least on the surface, with a Yorkist victory. But this triumph did not conclude the Civil War. It merely marked the opening act. Richard of York had captured the king on the battlefield and killed his rival, the Duke of Somerset. Yet this military success did not translate into lasting political power. The truce declared after the battle resembled a blank sheet labelled peace, empty both politically and constitutionally. England was still ruled by a king, but that king, Henry VI, remained fragile, passive, and dependent on those around him. Though York re-entered the political centre after St Albans, he was not formally reinstated as Lord Protector. As he had been in 1454, he held influence but not constitutional authority. Even with powerful allies like Warwick and Salisbury, York could not secure lasting support in Parliament. The post-war order was woven with ambiguity. There was a crown but no leadership, a government but no direction. Most crucially, not everyone believed in peace. Margaret of Anjou, in particular, never accepted the truce. She held York directly responsible for Somerset's death and viewed the entire episode as a coup against her husband. In the king's continued silence, Margaret emerged openly as a political actor. The greatest obstacle to peace became her unyielding fury and unwavering opposition. During this time, neither side rearmed, but they watched each other closely. York himself remained uneasy. His victory at St Albans brought neither lasting security nor widespread legitimacy. He was a man who had won, but who still had to justify his cause. This short truce was, in truth, a vacuum. The real war had not yet begun. Despite his victory at St Albans, Richard of York failed to establish stable rule. Instead, another figure quickly stepped into the spotlight: Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. In the aftermath of 1455, Warwick became more than a Yorkist ally. He emerged as a man of the people. His rise stemmed not only from lineage or military prowess, but from his ability to connect with urban politics in London. In the capital, Warwick quickly became a power centre. He was known for his communication with the public, his ties to merchants, and his commitment to order. His reputation grew not just through the sword, but through his bond with the people. Especially through his naval appointments, Warwick gained influence over the fleet, turning maritime control into both military and economic leverage. Rising Yorkist sympathy in Parliament, combined with popular fear of renewed civil war, allowed Warwick to be seen as a guardian of order. During this period, a growing passive dissatisfaction with Margaret and her Lancastrian allies left a void that Warwick eagerly filled. The king remained ineffective, Margaret appeared aggressive, and Warwick came to embody stability. While York himself remained a polarizing figure, Warwick emerged as a system-friendly alternative, someone who could carry Yorkist claims without threatening total upheaval. This balance would soon unravel and drag the country back into war. In September 1459, England again descended into conflict. The fragile peace established after St Albans had collapsed. Queen Margaret viewed the Yorkists as an ongoing threat, especially as Warwick's influence in London grew and York's royal ambitions became harder to ignore. In this environment, Margaret adopted a harsher stance. The goal was no longer peace, but purge. The Battle of Blore Heath became the first open expression of this renewed tension. York's ally, the Earl of Salisbury, Richard Neville, was marching south from the north to link up with York and Warwick. Margaret sought to prevent this union and dispatched a royal force to intercept them in Staffordshire. The army was led by Lord Audley, a staunch Lancastrian. While Margaret herself was not present, the army operated under her orders. On the morning of September 22, 1459, the two forces clashed on the open fields of Blore Heath. Salisbury's army was outnumbered. Roughly 5,000 Yorkist troops faced nearly 8,000 Lancastrians. Yet the outcome hinged not on numbers, but on strategy and discipline. Salisbury feigned a retreat to provoke his opponents. The Lancastrians mistook it for weakness and launched an attack. But it was a trap. The Yorkists had positioned themselves advantageously behind a narrow river crossing. As the Lancastrians attempted to force the crossing, the terrain disrupted their formation and turned the clash into chaos. Lord Audley was killed during the battle, and his death shattered the morale of his troops. More than a military win, this battle granted the Yorkists a crucial psychological victory. For the first time, they had defeated the king's forces in an organised field engagement. Blore Heath was not just a skirmish, it was a signal that the Civil War had entered an irreversible stage. It marked, in a sense, the moment bloodshed became a fixed front. The violence was no longer personal, it was dynastic. The kingdom was not merely fighting battles, but fracturing at its core. Still, this victory did not solidify Yorkist control. The royal faction, and especially Margaret, characterised the conflict as open rebellion, and they would soon exact a severe price for that rebellion. By late 1459, civil war had become inevitable. In response to the Yorkist triumph at Blore Heath, Queen Margaret and her allies prepared for full retaliation. The battle had served as an alarm, but now came the counterstrike. In October, the royal army mobilised. Margaret sought to encircle Warwick, York and Salisbury via Gloucester. The Yorkists, aware of the threat, entrenched themselves near Ludlow at Ludford Bridge. There, about 8,000 York. This time, the king himself accompanied the royal forces, marking a symbolic shift. But for the Yorkists, morale broke down even before battle began. The presence of the king stirred doubt among the troops. Many soldiers, especially those drawn from the Calais garrison, were hesitant to raise arms against their monarch. Margaret and her advisers exploited this, issuing general pardons to anyone who had abandoned the Yorkist cause. The psychological campaign worked. On the night of October 12, 1459, with royal forces camped nearby, defections began in the Yorkist camp. What followed was not a battle, but a collapse. York, Salisbury and Warwick fled before fighting even began. Warwick escaped to Calais, York fled to Ireland, Salisbury withdrew north with his son. Ludford Bridge was a defeat without combat, yet it was no less devastating. The Yorkists were no longer rebels, they were fugitives. Margaret and the royal faction seized the moment. Yorkist estates were confiscated, their supporters tried and some executed. A special parliament convened in Coventry and formally declared York, Warwick and Salisbury traitors to the crown. This has been described as a reassertion of royal authority, but not of stability. Margaret had triumphed, but England remained fractured, and loyalty to the throne was deeply unstable. Ludford Bridge was not the end of the Yorkist cause. It was the beginning of its second act. The humiliation radicalised figures like Warwick, turning their campaign into more than a dynastic feud. It was becoming a struggle over legitimacy itself. The bloodless victory at Ludford Bridge gave Margaret the opportunity she had long awaited. With the Yorkists dispersed, their leadership in exile and popular support momentarily silenced, the Queen turned her attention to erasing them legally as well as militarily. In October 1459, a parliament was held in Coventry, soon dubbed the Parliament of Devils. It was not just legislative, it was punitive. York, Warwick, Salisbury and their allies were convicted of treason. Their lands were seized, their titles revoked, their names disgraced. This was not merely war, it was the legal redefinition of legitimacy. In this moment, Margaret ceased to be merely the king's consort. Henry VI remained passive. Margaret now acted as England's visible ruler. She engaged directly with nobles, conducted diplomacy, and oversaw military planning. It was, in effect, her government. But this harsh approach did not breed lasting loyalty. The attainders of 1459 drove many Yorkist sympathisers underground, but not into silence. Rather, they began to regroup. For men like Warwick, the fight was no longer about power alone, it was about principle. Margaret's ascent came at the cost of a deeper fracture. The monarchy was now not only at war with swords, but with laws. After the Yorkist defeat at Ludford Bridge in 1459, their leaders were driven into exile. Richard of York fled to Ireland, while Salisbury and his son Warwick took refuge in Calais, a territory still under English control. But this exile did not mark the end of the Yorkist cause. It was the beginning of a new phase of preparation. Under Warwick's command, Calais became more than a safe haven. It functioned as an independent stronghold. There, he consolidated not just military power, but also naval and political influence. His control over the English fleet gave him a decisive strategic edge. During this period, the Yorkists were not simply waiting, they were laying the groundwork for a renewed campaign, both militarily and diplomatically. Meanwhile, public opinion in England began to shift in Warwick's favour. The 1459 Coventry Parliament, remembered as the Parliament of Devils, had declared Warwick, York and Salisbury traitors. But instead of appearing just, the act was widely seen as a political purge. Warwick, known for his communication with commoners and reputation as a champion of order, gained even greater popularity in the eyes of the people. In June 1460, Warwick, Salisbury and young Edward, York's son and the Earl of March, crossed the Channel and landed on the shores of Kent. To their surprise, they were welcomed warmly. The people of Kent did not see them as rebels, but as saviours who had returned to restore the kingdom's balance. Warwick's charisma had a powerful effect on the crowds. It wasn't just the commoners, merchants and some local officials also quietly supported the Yorkist return. Facing little resistance, Warwick's forces advanced toward London. Soon after, the gates of the capital were opened. The event was both symbolic and strategic. The Yorkists had returned not only with weapons, but with public backing. Warwick was no longer a fugitive. He had become a figure of authority and order within the capital itself. With that momentum, the Yorkists turned north to confront King Henry VI's forces. Just weeks after Warwick entered London, the Yorkist army began its march northward. Their goal was to locate the royal army and force a shift in the political balance. King Henry VI had set up camp near Northampton in the Midlands. The Lancastrians had chosen a defensive position protected by rivers and marshes, terrain that gave them a natural advantage. Among the Yorkist commanders were Warwick, Salisbury and Edward of March. But this confrontation wasn't just a military manoeuvre, it was also a psychological battle. The Yorkist message was carefully crafted. They claimed to be fighting not against the king, but against his evil counsellors. The aim was to undermine loyalty within the king's army. Surprisingly, the tactic worked. Lord Grey of Ruthin, one of the royal commanders, secretly pledged to switch sides before the battle. Ongoing property disputes had led Grey to seek favour from Yorkist allies in court, and Warwick promised to support his claims in return for his defection. On the morning of July 10th, the two armies faced each other across muddy ground under rainy skies. The king's forces held a defensive line, but the Yorkists advanced rapidly. At the critical moment of engagement, Grey's troops abandoned the Lancastrian ranks and joined the Yorkist side. The sudden betrayal sparked panic. The Lancastrian line collapsed. King Henry VI was taken without resistance, for the second time, the first being at St. Albans. But now the political context was more severe. The Yorkists no longer sought mere reform, they were aiming for power itself. Margaret of Anjou and the young Prince Edward were not present on the battlefield. Anticipating the coming conflict, they had fled northward in advance. Their escape severely undermined the morale of the Lancastrian leadership. In Yorkist propaganda, Margaret's absence was framed as the Queen abandoning her people. The Battle of Northampton was not a large-scale military engagement, but its political implications were seismic. The king's capture by the Yorkists for a second time reignited the question of constitutional order. With this victory, Warwick emerged not only as a battlefield commander, but also as a public symbol of stability. His image shifted from general to statesman. This moment marked the beginning of his transformation into the figure later known as the Kingmaker. Following the Yorkist victory at Northampton, they once again seized the political initiative. King Henry VI remained a prisoner, Margaret was still in flight, and Warwick had restored order in London. In October 1460, Richard of York finally returned from his exile in Ireland. But York's return was not just the comeback of a noble, it was followed by an unexpected and shocking move. Upon arriving at Westminster, York entered Parliament and, according to some accounts, walked straight toward the throne. Some chroniclers claim he even stood behind it for a time, as if staking an unspoken claim. This gesture, though brief, was deeply symbolic and unsettling. A heavy silence reportedly fell over the lords. Even Warwick, Salisbury, and other Yorkist leaders had not anticipated such a direct bid for kingship. Up until that point, their cause had been framed as one of loyal reform, opposing corrupt advisers, not the king himself. York had just changed that narrative. York's claim rested not only on military success, but on dynastic legitimacy. In his view, Henry IV had usurped the throne in 1399, unlawfully replacing Richard II. As a result, Henry VI, descended from that usurpation, had no rightful claim. York, by contrast, descended from Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second son, whereas the Lancastrians descended from John of Gaunt, the third son. According to York, true hereditary right belonged to his line. This was not just a political challenge, it was a direct assault on England's entire understanding of royal succession. Many lords were unprepared for it. A portion of the nobility, concerned with national stability, hesitated to support removing a sitting monarch. York's action created a rupture. It was no longer about advising the king, it was about replacing him. This moment transformed the Wars of the Roses from a constitutional crisis into a battle for the crown itself. York's bold claim to the throne shocked both Parliament and the broader political community. Though his legal argument was strong, the sudden transfer of royal power risked plunging the realm into chaos. To diffuse this tension, Parliament proposed a compromise on October 25, 1460, the Act of Accord. Under this agreement, Henry VI would remain king for the rest of his life. But upon his death, the crown would pass not to his son Edward, but to Richard of York or his heirs. In essence, Prince Edward's hereditary rights were revoked by law. For York, this was a historic triumph. He was no longer a claimant from the outside or a protector of the crown. He was now the official heir apparent. But for the Lancastrian camp, it was nothing short of betrayal. The most vehement opposition came from Margaret of Anjou. She categorically rejected the Act of Accord. In her eyes, the removal of her son's right to succeed was not merely a political defeat, it was the erasure of her dynasty. Margaret acted swiftly. She reached out to powerful northern nobles who still remained loyal to the Lancastrian cause. Around her gathered steadfast allies like Clifford, Northumberland, and Somerset. Though the Act of Accord was presented as a peace settlement, in reality it served as the catalyst for renewed war. For Margaret, this was no longer just about her son's rights. It had become a fight for the survival of the Lancastrian line. Following the agreement, England was effectively split in two. In the south, the Yorkists held the political centre with the support of Parliament and London. But in the north, Margaret was building a rival power base with nobles who refused to recognise the settlement. Faced with this polarisation, Richard of York chose action over caution. In December 1460, he left his sons in London and marched north with a small force of around 5,000 men. He stationed himself at Sandal Castle, near Wakefield. York's objective was to curtail Margaret's rising influence and dismantle her growing web of support among the northern lords. But the threat he faced was far greater than he anticipated. Margaret had forged a formidable alliance that included Somerset, Northumberland, and Lord Clifford. These Lancastrian commanders surrounded York's position at Sandal Castle. Some estimates place the size of the Lancastrian army at around 15,000 men, 3 times the size of York's forces. Why, then, did York advance against such a superior force with so few troops? Historians offer various interpretations. The most common view is that York believed the enemy forces were divided, and that he could strike before they consolidated. Some sources suggest he had received intelligence that a portion of the Lancastrian camp was prepared to defect. If so, this misinformation may have been a deliberate trap. On 30 December 1460, York left the safety of the castle and led his troops into open battle. But his plan quickly collapsed. The Lancastrians, far from being disorganised, responded with a well-coordinated assault. The Yorkist lines, overwhelmed and outnumbered, soon broke formation. What followed was less a battle and more a massacre. York's son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, only 17 years old, tried to flee the field. But he was captured near a riverbank by Lord Clifford. According to several chroniclers, Clifford killed him mercilessly, despite his youth, a deed that would become a powerful symbol of vengeance for the Yorkist cause. Richard of York himself was also killed. Some accounts say in battle, others that he was captured and executed. His head was severed, mounted on a spike, and displayed above Micklegate Bar in the city of York. It was mockingly adorned with a paper crown, and beneath it hung a chilling message, "Let York look upon York." York's ally Salisbury was captured a few days later and executed. In the span of just a few days, the Yorkist faction lost 3 of its most prominent leaders: Richard of York, his son Edmund, and the Earl of Salisbury. The Battle of Wakefield stands as one of the most traumatic episodes of the Wars of the Roses. For the Yorkist cause, it was not merely a military defeat, it was a dynastic catastrophe. After this, the conflict would shift from a matter of principle to a struggle for revenge. Wakefield was more than a battlefield loss. It was a historical collapse for the Yorkist movement. Richard of York's army, vastly outnumbered and surrounded by unexpectedly unified Lancastrian forces, was crushed. Tactical miscalculations, numerical disadvantage, and possibly deliberate misinformation had made defeat almost inevitable. Richard of York was killed in the fighting. Some sources claim he died in combat, others suggest he was captured and executed afterward. But the outcome was the same. The founder of the Yorkist cause was no more. Even more shocking was the death of his son. Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was just 17 years old. As he attempted to flee the field, he was captured near the river by Lord Clifford. According to some accounts, Rutland knelt and begged for mercy, but Clifford killed him without hesitation. The event would become a lasting symbol of Yorkist vengeance, passed down for generations. Salisbury, the father of Richard Neville, was taken prisoner. The following day, without any form of trial, he was executed. This act reflected the hardening stance of the Lancastrian leadership. Wakefield had made the conflict a fight to the death. But the most chilling message came with the fate of Richard of York's head. It was severed, mounted on a pike, and displayed atop the walls of the city of York. A paper crown was mockingly placed upon it. This was not merely political theatre, it was a public humiliation and a declaration of dominance. Wakefield was not just a battle, it was the destruction of a generation. Yet from the ashes of this disaster, a new figure would rise. Richard's surviving eldest son, Edward of March. The harsh winter of January 1461 did nothing to halt military activity in the south and west of England. After the disaster at Wakefield, leadership of the House of York passed to Richard's eldest son, Edward, Earl of March. Though only in his early 20s, Edward's energy and resolute bearing quickly made him the new hope of the Yorkist cause. The Lancastrians wasted no time in striking back. Forces gathered in Wales advanced from the west under the command of Jasper Tudor. He was joined by James Butler, Earl of Ormond, Henry VI's half-brother, and a staunch supporter. Their aim was to break Yorkist influence in the west and prevent Edward from advancing towards London. Edward moved to intercept the enemy near Mortimer's Cross. This was a strategic crossroads, the point where the roads from Wales converged, making it the ideal location to block the enemy's passage into the interior. Edward commanded around 5,000 men. The Lancastrian army was somewhat smaller, though reinforced by local troops familiar with the terrain. On the morning of the battle, an event occurred that would pass into legend. As dawn broke, 3 brilliant suns appeared on the horizon, a rare atmospheric phenomenon known as a parhelion, or sundog. The cold winter air, filled with ice crystals, refracted the sunlight to create the illusion of 3 distinct orbs. Among the soldiers, this extraordinary sight stirred unease. Some took it as a bad omen, but Edward saw an opportunity. Addressing his troops, he declared that the 3 suns represented himself and his brothers, George and Richard, a divine sign that God favoured their cause. This display revealed not only Edward's charisma, but also his gift for psychological warfare. Morale surged. The fighting was fierce. Edward held a strong line in the centre, while using swift cavalry manoeuvres on the flanks. The Lancastrians resisted at first, but their lines eventually broke under Edward's discipline and superior tactics. Jasper Tudor and the Earl of Ormond were forced to retreat to avoid total rout. The battle ended in a decisive Yorkist victory. The triumph was more than just a military success, it carried strategic weight. Coming so soon after the calamity of Wakefield, it revived Yorkist morale. Edward, despite his youth, had proven himself both on the battlefield and as a leader. The 3 sons phenomenon quickly became central to Yorkist propaganda. Edward would later add the symbol to his personal arms, cementing his image as God's chosen king. Mortimer's Cross marked the moment Edward's star began to rise. He was no longer merely heir to the House of York, he was a leader capable of altering the course of the war. The path ahead now led to greater challenges. The victory at Mortimer's Cross had bolstered Yorkist spirits, but the fate of the war would not be decided on a single front. In the north, Margaret of Anjou still commanded a powerful Lancastrian army. After her great triumph at Wakefield, she had proven her authority as queen, rallying loyal commanders such as Somerset, Northumberland, and Clifford to her side. Her objective was clear: to regain King Henry VI for the Lancastrian cause and end Yorkist political dominance. Yorkist power in London rested largely in the hands of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Since his return from Calais, Warwick had maintained order in the capital and deployed his forces in the south to block Margaret's advance. King Henry remained in Yorkist custody, a loss that was both strategic and symbolic for Margaret. In February 1461, Margaret marched her army south. Along the way, she gathered more troops from loyal northern lords. Warwick moved to intercept her, establishing a defensive position at St. Albans. Ironically, this was the very place where the first blood of the Wars of the Roses had been shed. But this time, the roles were reversed. The Lancastrians were attacking and the Yorkists were defending. On the morning of 17th February, the battle began. Warwick had fortified the southern approaches to the town with ditches and barricades, positioning his artillery at key points. But Margaret's commanders, most notably Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, chose not to attack head-on. Instead, they manoeuvred around the town, striking at the Yorkist lines from the flank. Warwick's positions quickly came under heavy pressure. As the fighting intensified, disorder began to spread through the Yorkist ranks. The streets of St. Albans soon became a battleground of house-to-house combat. Warwick resisted at first, but Lancastrian cavalry manoeuvres and superior numbers broke his defence. By the afternoon, the Yorkist line collapsed. The most decisive moment came when King Henry VI was freed. Lancastrian troops discovered him in one of the houses guarded by Yorkist soldiers. Throughout the battle, Henry remained passive. Chroniclers describe him sitting calmly amid the noise and chaos. When Margaret regained her husband, it was more than a military success. It was a symbolic restoration of Lancastrian morale. After the battle, the Yorkist army scattered, and Warwick was forced to withdraw north. But Margaret's victory did not open the road to London automatically. In the aftermath, her troops began looting the surrounding villages and towns, seizing food, supplies, and money, punishing those who resisted. This behaviour quickly destroyed Lancastrian reputation in the eyes of the London populace. Margaret pressed southward towards the capital, but the gates of London remained shut. The city's merchant guilds and civic leaders feared the Queen could not control her army's looting. Moreover, news of Warwick's continued resistance and Edward of March's victory at Mortimer's Cross kept Yorkist support alive in the city. Thus, Margaret failed to turn her battlefield victory into political advantage. Though she had regained custody of Henry VI, she was forced to retreat north without winning London's allegiance. The Second Battle of St Albans ended in a Lancastrian military triumph and returned Henry VI to Margaret's side. Yet her inability to enter London shifted the political balance. As the Queen's army withdrew north, Warwick and the young Edward, Earl of March, moved quickly. Fresh from his triumph at Mortimer's Cross, Edward marched rapidly towards London. Meeting up with Warwick, they entered the capital together, lifting Yorkist morale to new heights. The citizens, having heard of the Lancastrian army's looting, welcomed them as liberators. On the 4th of March, 1461, Parliament convened. The question before them was not merely who held power in practice, but who was lawfully entitled to the throne. The Act of Accord was still technically in force, naming York or his heirs as successors upon Henry VI's death. But Richard, Duke of York, was now dead, and his eldest son Edward stood in his place. The Lancastrians had openly defied the agreement, and Margaret was raising a new army in the north. Yorkist leaders concluded that leaving Henry VI on the throne could no longer restore stability. Parliament ruled that Henry had broken the contract and driven the realm into chaos, and was therefore no longer fit to be king. They then declared that Edward, the rightful heir of the House of York, should take the throne immediately. That day, the 18-year-old Edward was proclaimed King Edward IV before the people and the lords at Westminster. Tall, powerfully built and decisive on the battlefield, Edward won the backing not only of the nobility but also of the people of the capital. Yet his coronation brought no peace. It only set the stage for an even greater confrontation. In the north, Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrian army had no intention of recognising the new king. The Wars of the Roses were no longer a series of scattered clashes. They had become a struggle for the very future of the realm. Refusing to acknowledge Edward's claim, the Lancastrians assembled a massive army in the north. Margaret, Henry VI, and the young Prince Edward remained near the Scottish border, but their forces were commanded by some of the most powerful northern lords, notably Somerset, Northumberland, and Clifford. The Yorkist aim was clear: destroy the Lancastrians in a single decisive blow and secure their hold on the throne. Edward marched north with his allies, including Warwick and the Duke of Norfolk. The Lancastrians prepared to block their advance, establishing a defensive position near the village of Towton. This would be the largest pitched battle of the Wars of the Roses. Contemporary chronicles suggest the combined forces exceeded 50,000 men. Some estimates put the Yorkists at around 35,000 and the Lancastrians at roughly 40,000. Both sides were determined. This was no longer about who would guide the king. It was about who would be the King of England. The Lancastrians took position behind a ridge, with open ground before them broken by marshes and narrow approaches. The Yorkists would have to advance uphill to attack. On the morning of the battle, a fierce snowstorm set in. The wind blew from behind the Yorkist lines, driving the snow into the faces of the Lancastrians. Visibility was poor, making it difficult for archers to pick their targets. Yorkist archers took full advantage of the wind, extending their range so that their arrows struck home while Lancastrian shafts fell short. After the initial volleys, Edward ordered his archers to withdraw. The Lancastrians, thinking their foes were retreating, advanced in pursuit, only to lose their formation in the marshy ground, taking early losses. By late morning, the armies clashed along the full front. Norfolk commanded the Yorkist right, Edward the centre, and Warwick the left. In the Lancastrian centre stood Somerset, with Northumberland and other northern lords on the flanks. For hours, the advantage swung back and forth. In the centre, superior Lancastrian numbers began to push the Yorkists back. Warwick was badly wounded but refused to leave the field, dismounting to fight alongside his men. The battle became a brutal war of attrition. The snow still fell, and the ground turned to deep mud. Then, late in the day, fresh Yorkist troops under the Duke of Norfolk arrived. Norfolk struck suddenly at the Lancastrian left flank. Exhausted and battered, the Lancastrian line gave way. Edward seized the moment, ordering an all-out assault in the centre. The Lancastrian army broke. Marshes and narrow defiles turned the retreat into a slaughter. At Cockbeck, the stream was choked with bodies. Thousands drowned while trying to escape. Towton became the bloodiest single day in England's Civil War history. Over 20,000 men were killed, a staggering toll for the time. Much of the Lancastrian leadership was dead or captured. Northumberland fell in battle. Somerset and a few others managed to flee. Henry VI, Margaret, and Prince Edward escaped into Scotland immediately after the defeat. For Edward, the victory was more than a military triumph. It was the ultimate confirmation of his claim. On 28th June 1461, at Westminster Abbey, he was crowned the first Yorkist king. Towton changed the course of the Wars of the Roses forever. From that point on, the Lancastrians would survive only in exile or in scattered resistance. After Edward IV's victory at the Battle of Towton in 1461, he began the task of rebuilding a fractured England, a country ravaged by civil wars. The post-war period plunged the country into significant political uncertainty and instability. Edward did not only win the war, he put in great effort to restore the workings of government and gain the trust of the people. However, this process would not be easy, as much of the country was still under Lancastrian control and the royal authority remained fragile. Firstly, after his coronation, Edward took steps to consolidate his power. He asserted himself as the crowned king and rewarded his supporters to strengthen the legitimacy of his throne. One of his most important supporters was the wealthy and powerful Neville family. The Earl of Warwick, Richard Neville, remained Edward's most significant ally, just as he had been before the war. Warwick also held a crucial position as the governor of Calais, England's last foothold in France, which was strategically vital. Warwick's power in Calais provided him with both military and political advantages. Warwick was also one of the strongest figures supporting Edward IV's rule. During this period, the Neville family and other allies expanded their lands and titles, gaining substantial influence. This was an important step in solidifying Edward's rule, but Warwick's growing power would lead to conflicts in the years to come. Edward's greatest achievement during this period was rewarding his supporters and granting them power in strategic regions. This laid the groundwork for building support networks across the country and securing his kingdom on solid foundations. However, Edward's efforts to strengthen his leadership within the country were not only about managing enemies within, but also about managing his relationships with his allies. As the king tried to unite the country, Warwick's rising power would eventually become a threat to him. Yet, at this point, a relationship of trust still existed between Warwick and Edward. In 1461, with Edward IV's ascension to the throne, the balance in the Wars of the Roses had shifted. However, despite their defeat, the Lancastrians did not surrender, and they continued their resistance in the north against the setbacks in the south. Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou fled England to Scotland, where they began raising a new army and connecting with their northern supporters. During this time, Margaret continued to communicate with the still powerful Lancastrian forces, seeking support from both local nobles and former allies. Stationed in Scotland, Margaret rallied the northern English nobility. During this period, the Lancashire region and other local landowners in the north remained loyal to Margaret, and several rebellions erupted in England's northern borders. Henry VI and Margaret worked to incite these rebellions and stir the people in the south to rise up against the Yorkist government. In 1462 and 1463, the Lancastrians increased their activity in northern territories. However, Margaret and Henry's strategy would ultimately prove unsuccessful in the long run. The Yorkists put considerable effort into suppressing this resistance. Leading the Yorkist government were Warwick, one of the successful commanders of the war, and Edward IV. However, the resistance in the north was strong, and Margaret's powerful allies were still active on this front. After years of civil war, the Yorkists launched a series of large-scale operations to suppress the northern resistance. By 1464, the last major Lancastrian resistance ended with the Battle of Hexham. The Yorkists achieved a significant victory at Hexham, defeating much of the Lancastrian army. This victory marked a major turning point for the Yorkists, and the resistance in the north was largely broken. The Lancastrians no longer held any significant land in the north, and this front of the war was effectively closed. In 1465, Henry was captured by the Yorkists as he returned from his exile in Scotland and imprisoned in the Tower of London. In 1464, shortly after Edward IV's ascension to the throne, a significant development occurred within the kingdom. Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow from the Lancaster side. This marriage resonated not only within England, but also across European politics. Elizabeth was a member of the Woodville family, a once noble but politically weak lineage. However, this marriage was not just a personal choice, it was a direct challenge to Warwick's plans. Warwick, Edward IV's loyal ally and one of the kingdom's strongest figures in foreign relations, had been working on marriage negotiations with the French, planning to marry Edward to the sister of the French king. Warwick aimed to strengthen both his own influence and England's relationship with France through this union. But Edward's decision to marry Elizabeth Woodville instead of following Warwick's plans not only humiliated Warwick, but also dealt him a significant political blow. Warwick was deeply disappointed by this turn of events. His and his family's years of loyalty and diplomatic efforts had been disregarded. After Elizabeth Woodville became queen, the Woodville family rapidly ascended to the peak of power, weakening Warwick's influence. The swift rise of the Woodville family became a direct threat to Warwick, as the new Queen's family secured a very powerful position at court. Warwick's diminishing authority within the royal court put both himself and the future of the royal family in jeopardy. The influence gained by Elizabeth and her family in the court weakened Warwick's power and created a dilemma for Edward IV, who found himself caught between protecting himself and his throne. Warwick, once merely an ally, had now become a rival within the court, and this would deepen the internal struggles within the kingdom in the years to come. After Edward IV's ascension to the throne, Warwick's position gradually weakened. Once a strong ally, Warwick was now more of a figurehead than a trusted supporter, and he began to pose a threat. Edward's marriage decision and the swift rise of the Woodville family rapidly diminished Warwick's influence. This new power dynamic within the royal court isolated Warwick and allowed his rivals to rise. To fill this gap, Warwick grew closer to Edward's younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Clarence eventually became one of Warwick's closest allies. This alliance went beyond personal ties and soon turned into a direct threat against Edward. Using his relationship with Clarence, Warwick sought to regain his power in the court and control the royal family. However, this alliance quickly became a target for Warwick's enemies within the court, as it began to undermine the authority of both the palace and Edward himself. During this time, Warwick's strategies and political manoeuvres led to his further isolation from the royal court. His alliance with Clarence soon became a direct threat to Edward, making Warwick's position increasingly fragile. This process turned Warwick and Clarence into two opposing factions within the kingdom, each embroiled in a serious internal conflict. In 1469, Warwick and Clarence initiated an open rebellion against Edward IV. Edward's rule and the influence of the Woodville family particularly enraged Warwick. Warwick, with support from the rural areas and local nobles, incited a rebellion against Edward. With Clarence's backing, Warwick began uprisings in Yorkshire and other northern regions. Their goal was to weaken the Woodville family's power at court and depose Edward from the throne. The rebellion initiated by Warwick and Clarence brought them into direct confrontation with Edward IV's army. In 1469, the two armies clashed at Edgecote Moor. Although Edward's forces initially showed strength, after prolonged combat, the rebels under Warwick's leadership emerged victorious. Edward's army suffered a heavy defeat, and Edward was briefly captured. While this seemed like a significant victory for Warwick and Clarence, they failed to gather the political support they needed. However, Warwick was unable to secure enough backing to overthrow the king, and Edward was soon released and returned to the throne. While Warwick and Clarence's rebellion was temporarily successful, it did not bring lasting change. Edward IV successfully re-secured his throne and managed to suppress the rebellion, strengthening his power. This victory not only reinforced Edward's authority, but also pushed Warwick to become increasingly isolated, ultimately driving him to take more radical steps. Following the failed rebellion of 1469, Warwick continued to view Edward IV's rule and the influence of the Woodville family as a significant threat. The failure of his rebellion pushed him toward a more radical solution. In 1470, Warwick, in a final move, completely abandoned the York family, marking the beginning of what would be known as the Devilish Alliance. He allied with Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrians. Warwick made a secret agreement with Margaret in France. The primary goal of this alliance was to restore the Lancaster family to the throne. Warwick played a key role in this plan by ensuring his daughter married Clarence, Edward IV's brother. Clarence's marriage to Margaret's daughter strengthened the ties between the Lancaster and York families, deepening the rivalry between them and intensifying the struggle for power within the country. This change in allegiance was a massive blow to the Yorkists. Once one of the most powerful supporters of the York family, Warwick now placed his own interests and Margaret's before the York cause, aiming to restore the Lancastrians to the throne. In October 1470, the alliance between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou marked a pivotal turn. Warwick returned to England with a French-backed army and deposed Edward IV, who had only recently reclaimed the throne. After this catastrophe, Edward IV returned to a country plagued by famine and unrest. The victory of Warwick and Margaret briefly restored Henry VI to the throne. Henry VI, after a 9-year absence, sat on the throne once again, but this return was purely symbolic. King Henry had reached the peak of his mental decline, and his capacity to rule was severely diminished. He had essentially become a puppet king. Both his deteriorating health and the state of the country had drained him of his former leadership strength. This brief period is known in history as the readeption, reaccession period. Henry VI's return to the throne was not only a ceremonial event, but also a reflection of the continued political uncertainty and instability in England. Under Warwick's control, Henry's return symbolised that the true power struggle was far from over, with the real leader of the government remaining Warwick, lurking behind the scenes. In the autumn of 1470, Warwick's triumph, the restoration of Henry VI's, and Edward IV's exile to Burgundy appeared to be a crushing blow for the House of York. But the situation did not last long. During his brief time in exile, Edward received cautious support from the Duke of Burgundy, and in March 1471, with only a few hundred men, he set sail from Flanders back to England. At first, Edward's chances looked desperately slim. He had only a small force at his side, while much of England still lay under Warwick's and the Lancastrians' influence. Yet Edward's strategy was not to march directly on the capital, but instead to push north and rally support in his family's own territories. The plan quickly bore fruit. Along the way, former allies and Yorkist nobles joined his banner. Within weeks, the exiled king's tiny retinue had grown into an army of thousands. Warwick proved unable to halt Edward's rapid advance. And when Edward, in a shrewd move, reached London, the gates of the city opened to him. The capital's people were weary of Warwick's harsh rule and resentful of Margaret's faction. Edward, by contrast, was young, charismatic, and remembered for his courage on the battlefield, and he swiftly won back popular support. Thus, in March 1471, Edward, who had lost his crown only a year earlier, returned to London in triumph after a campaign that had begun with almost hopeless odds. Now, all that remained was to crush Warwick and the Lancastrians in open battle. Edward's re-entry into London was enough to restore him as king, but securing the throne beyond doubt required Warwick's destruction. For the Kingmaker still commanded a formidable army and was determined to bring Edward down. The two forces finally met on the morning of the 14th of April, 1471, near the town of Barnet, just north of London. The morning of battle was shrouded in heavy fog. The thick mist limited visibility and obscured the positions of both armies. This would prove a decisive factor in the struggle. Edward arranged his men with himself in the centre, his younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, on the right, and Lord Hastings commanding the left. Warwick's army, larger in number, was deployed with the Earl of Oxford on the left, Warwick and his brother Montague in the centre, and the Duke of Exeter on the right. At dawn, Oxford's troops launched a fierce assault on the Yorkist right and drove it back. Portions of Edward's line wavered and fell into disorder, but the fog sowed chaos across the field. As Oxford's men wheeled back, flushed with success, Warwick's own troops mistook them for Yorkists in the mist and attacked. The blunder shattered the Lancastrian formation and spread panic through their ranks. Edward seized the moment. Exploiting the confusion, he ordered a furious charge at the enemy's centre. On the right, Gloucester regrouped the shaken Yorkists and counterattacked. The tide turned swiftly against Warwick. By midday, his army was breaking apart. Oxford's men fled, Exeter was gravely wounded, and Warwick mounted his horse in a last attempt to rally his soldiers. But it was too late. Warwick and his brother Montague were slain on the field, a loss that not only destroyed their army, but dealt a mortal blow to the Lancastrian cause. One of the battle's most dramatic twists was the defection of George, Duke of Clarence. Edward's brother had earlier sided with Warwick, but in the heat of battle, Clarence shifted allegiance back to Edward, lending his weight to the Yorkist cause. His decision strengthened Edward's hand and sealed Warwick's fate. Barnet was not merely a victory, it was a turning point. The death of Warwick meant the removal of one of the most powerful and influential figures of the Wars of the Roses. The Kingmaker was gone, and with him the main pillar of Lancastrian morale had collapsed. For Edward, this was the greatest step yet in re-establishing his hold on the throne. Yet Warwick's fall did not end the struggle. At the very same time, Margaret of Anjou and her young son Prince Edward had returned from France. With them came a fresh army, composed of loyal English nobles and French supporters. Margaret intended to seize this final opportunity to secure her son's future. But Edward IV moved swiftly. After defeating Warwick at Barnet, He quickly regrouped his forces and marched to intercept Margaret's host, pressing them southward. The Lancastrians, hoping to gather reinforcements, pushed westward toward the Welsh border. Edward caught them before they could. The two armies faced one another near the town of Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire. On the morning of the 4th of May, the armies arrayed themselves for battle. Edward commanded a force of roughly 5,000 to 6,000 men. His younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, held the right wing. Edward himself commanded the centre, and Lord Hastings led the left. The Lancastrians fielded a slightly larger host, perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 strong. The Duke of Somerset commanded the right, Prince Edward and the Duke of Devon the centre, and Lord Wenlock the left. Margaret remained behind, at her son's side, but away from the fighting. The Lancastrians had chosen a strong defensive position. Their backs were to the River Severn, making retreat difficult, but also securing their rear. In front of them lay hedges and ditches, obstacles the Yorkists would have to cross in any assault. At dawn, Yorkist artillery opened the battle. Edward's gunners and archers battered the Lancastrian lines. The barrage did not break their position, but it signalled the clash to come. In response, Somerset ordered a sudden assault from the Lancastrian right. His troops advanced covertly, striking at the Yorkist left from the flank. At first, the manoeuvre succeeded. Hastings's men wavered and began to fall back. But Edward countered with a masterstroke. He unleashed the reserve he had concealed on his right, Richard of Gloucester's troops. They wheeled into action, meeting Somerset's charge head-on. Meanwhile, Yorkist light cavalry, hidden in the woods, swept into Somerset's rear. Within moments, his wing fell into disorder. Furious, Somerset galloped back toward the Lancastrian lines, only to see that the centre, under Lord Wenlock, had failed to advance. According to chroniclers, Somerset accused Wenlock of treachery and, in a rage, smashed his staff down upon Wenlock's head, killing him outright. This dramatic scene is remembered in the chronicles as a turning point of the battle. The paralysis of the centre doomed the Lancastrian army. At that very moment, Edward ordered a great assault against the middle of their line. Yorkist infantry surged forward, supported by Gloucester's wing. The Lancastrian formation began to crumble. As panic spread, soldiers fled toward the Severn and the narrow lanes behind their camp. Many drowned in the river. Others were cut down in the woods by pursuing Yorkist troops. Edward's men gave no quarter, relentlessly hunting the fleeing enemy. In the chaos of the battle, Prince Edward was captured. Some sources claim he was slain on the field. Others suggest he was brought before Edward IV and executed on the spot. Whatever the truth, the death of the 17-year-old prince dealt a fatal blow to the future of the Lancastrian cause. Margaret of Anjou attempted to flee, but was soon taken prisoner. The Queen, who had defied the Yorkists for years, was now defeated, bereft of her son, and at the mercy of her enemies. Tewkesbury proved to be one of the decisive battles of the Wars of the Roses. Edward IV had destroyed the Lancastrian heir, captured Margaret, and crushed the last threat rising out of the north. Many leading Lancastrian nobles were killed or captured. The Duke of Devon fell in the fighting, while Somerset was executed. This victory secured Edward's power once and for all. With the heir dead and Margaret in captivity, the House of Lancaster no longer had a viable champion. Yet even in triumph, one final matter remained. The deposed King Henry VI, still imprisoned in the Tower of London. If Edward was to guarantee his throne, the old king would have to be dealt with. After the crushing victory at Tewkesbury, the last obstacle before the Yorkist dynasty was the former king. Margaret was a captive, Prince Edward was dead, and most Lancastrian lords had been executed or destroyed. Henry's presence was now little more than symbolic, but even that symbol was dangerous. For as long as he lived, there remained the possibility that some lords might rise again in the name of the rightful king. On the night of 21st May 1471, Edward IV entered London in triumph. That same night, Henry VI was found dead in his cell in the Tower. The official explanation claimed he had died of melancholy, but contemporary chroniclers and later historians agree it was murder. Most likely he was killed on Edward's orders, perhaps by the king's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The death of Henry VI marked not only the end of a king, but the effective extinction of the Lancastrian line. Prince Edward was dead, Margaret was a prisoner, and Henry himself had been eliminated. Edward IV now faced no real rival to his throne. After 1471, England entered, for the first time in decades, a period of relative peace under Yorkist rule. Yet even this peace could not prevent new conflicts from taking root in the shadow of the crown. 1471 was a decisive turning point in the Wars of the Roses. At Barnet and Tewkesbury, the Yorkists won crushing victories, eliminating their two greatest threats. The kingmaker Warwick was slain, and the Lancastrian heir, Prince Edward, was killed on the battlefield. Soon after, the deposed King Henry VI, imprisoned in the Tower of London, was eliminated on Edward IV's orders, most likely by his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. With this, the House of Lancaster was effectively erased from history. The Yorkists now stood without any true rival. Edward IV, only a year removed from the catastrophe of 1470, was once again England's undisputed ruler. His authority was now firmly established, both on the battlefield and in the political arena. No longer forced to govern under Warwick's shadow, Edward had become a monarch in his own right. Royal power under his rule reached a level of centralisation not seen in decades. Across the realm, a sense of relative stability followed years of bloody conflict. Many of the great lords were dead, exiled, or had bent the knee to Edward. Trade revived, especially in London, where confidence in the economy returned. For a brief moment, the triumph of the House of York gave England room to breathe. Yet this peace would not last. The collapse of the Lancastrians brought to the surface tensions within the Yorkist camp itself. The rapid rise of the Woodville family, elevated through Edward's marriage, unsettled the older powers at court. George, Duke of Clarence, nurtured dangerous ambitions, and although Richard of Gloucester remained steadfastly loyal, the seeds of future discord were already being sown. Edward had destroyed his rivals abroad, but within his own dynasty, a new storm was gathering. Edward IV's younger brother, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, had earned a reputation throughout the wars for his shifting loyalties. Ambitious from an early age, Clarence never fully accepted his brother's kingship. Deep down, he believed he too had a rightful claim to the throne. In 1469, he had joined forces with Warwick to rebel against Edward, even playing a role in Warwick's diabolical alliance with France. Yet, before the Battle of Barnet, Clarence defected back to Edward's side, helping secure his brother's victory. Still, this volte-face did not make him a trustworthy ally. By the mid-1470s, Clarence's position at court had grown increasingly problematic. Edward's queen, Elizabeth Woodville, and her numerous kin had risen swiftly to prominence, consolidating influence around the throne. Their sudden ascent infuriated not only Warwick in the past, but now Clarence as well. He came to view the Woodvilles as a direct threat to his own influence. Bound to Edward less by loyalty than by envy, Clarence was becoming a dangerous presence. As a prince of the blood, he possessed undeniable legitimacy, but he also entrenched himself at the heart of factional intrigue. In his eyes, Edward was not a rightful king, but a usurper who had stolen what was his by right. This ambition would ultimately chart Clarence's path to ruin. Edward's external enemies had been vanquished, but within his own family, the gravest danger was beginning to take shape. In 1476, fate dealt Clarence a devastating blow. His wife, Isabel Neville, daughter of the Kingmaker, died unexpectedly. Shaken by grief, Clarence grew more volatile, and his political ambitions turned increasingly destructive. His hatred and mistrust of the Woodvilles, once veiled, erupted into open opposition at court. Clarence became entangled in plots against the royal court. Rumours swirled of sorcery and poisonings, while Clarence openly challenged the king's policies before the council. For Edward IV, his brother's conduct was no longer a mere family quarrel. It posed a direct threat to the stability of the realm. In 1478, Clarence was put on trial for treason. Parliament declared him guilty. Edward hesitated for a long time. After all, this was his own brother. But in the end, for the security of the kingdom, he had no choice but to sanction Clarence's execution. The manner of Clarence's death became one of the most debated episodes in English history. Officially, he was executed, yet contemporary rumour insisted he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Though impossible to prove, this tale was repeated so often in chronicles that it entered legend, remembered as one of the strangest executions in the nation's history. Thus, Edward IV eliminated one of the gravest threats within his own dynasty. But Clarence's fall revealed just how deep the fractures within the House of York truly ran. Edward's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stood in stark contrast to Clarence. He never pursued the crown for himself. Instead, he became known as Edward's most loyal supporter and most capable servant. From an early age, Richard distinguished himself by discipline, determination, and reliability. Edward entrusted him with the defence and governance of the northern borderlands. There, Richard was able to establish a formidable base of his own. His seat was at Middleham Castle, from which he forged strong ties with local gentry through marriage alliances and patronage. Around him grew a northern affinity, a network of loyal knights and landholders stretching from Yorkshire to Northumberland. This gave Richard both political influence and military strength. Richard was not only a commander, but also an able administrator. Court records often describe him as stern, but fair. Among the northern population, his reputation was high. He was seen as a just lord who brought order, and this bolstered his authority in the region. For Edward IV, Richard was a pillar of reliability. The king entrusted the stability of the north entirely to his brother's abilities. Through his loyalty and competence, Richard emerged as one of the most important figures in the Yorkist dynasty. With Warwick dead and the House of Lancaster destroyed, the power of central authority in England grew markedly stronger. There was no longer a kingmaker to check the monarch's will. Edward IV could now act on his own decisions without interference. Yet one great issue lingered: the lands and estates of the dispossessed Lancastrians. These properties were redistributed among the Yorkists after Edward's victory. Loyal supporters were rewarded, but excluded families nursed deep resentment. This discontent planted the seeds of future opposition to the throne. A striking feature of Edward's policy was his willingness to elevate not only great magnates, but also lesser gentry. In this way, he sought to curb the dominance of the high nobility and to cultivate a governing class more loyal to the crown. While this balancing act strengthened Edward's hold on power, it also created tension with the traditional aristocracy. One of the figures who rose to prominence in this period was the Duke of Buckingham. Within the royalist bureaucracy, Buckingham and men like him strengthened Edward's authority at court. Decision-making in England was no longer in the hands of powerful individual magnates, but was increasingly directed by the king himself and a circle of chosen advisers. By the mid-1470s, Edward IV faced a major test in foreign policy. In keeping with traditional Yorkist aims, he sought to pressure France and perhaps recover the lands England had lost. In 1475, Edward prepared a great campaign, mustered his army, and crossed into France. Many expected this to mark the beginning of a new phase of the 100 Years' War. Yet the outcome was decided not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table. Edward signed the Treaty of Picquigny, withdrawing his forces without fighting. Under the terms of the treaty, King Louis I of France agreed to pay Edward and England a substantial annual pension. The settlement was controversial among Edward's contemporaries. Some accused him of shirking war and tarnishing the honour of the realm. But financially, the diplomacy was highly profitable. The royal treasury gained immense revenues while avoiding the risks and expenses of renewed war. Edward IV's French campaign revealed him as a pragmatic king. He had secured victory not with the sword, but with gold. This move strengthened both the stability of his reign and the financial foundations of the crown. Edward IV died on the 9th of April 1483 at the age of just 40. His death was sudden, and it plunged the realm into uncertainty. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to explain the cause. Some pointed to pneumonia or dysentery. Others suggested stroke or ailments connected with Edward's increasing obesity. What was certain was that a king who had appeared strong and vigorous was gone without warning, and England was left on the edge of crisis. The heir to the throne was his 12-year-old son, Edward, who would be known as Edward V. But as a child, he could not exercise true authority. The succession immediately triggered a fierce contest for power within the court and among the nobility. Edward IV's legacy was a double-edged one. His strong rule had brought relative stability to England, but it had also fostered rivalries and mistrust within the dynasty. With a boy king now on the throne, those tensions would soon erupt, driving England into a new political storm. In the spring of 1483, when Edward IV died, the heir to the throne was his 12-year-old son, Edward. Known to history as Edward V, the young prince was seen as a beacon of hope for the kingdom's future, yet his youth posed a serious problem. In such a turbulent age, it was unthinkable that a child could rule effectively. Prince Edward had been sent north by his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and her family. But as he made his way toward London, he was intercepted by his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard had long been Edward IV's most loyal supporter and the trusted military commander who secured the north. According to Edward IV's final wishes, Richard was declared Protector of the Realm, a title that effectively handed him control of the government until the boy king was formally crowned. From this moment, court politics became deadly. The Woodville family sought to place Edward on the throne as quickly as possible, securing their influence by ruling in his name. Their goal was to dominate the royal household and shape the new reign to their advantage. Richard, however, opposed such haste. He argued that the young king was not yet ready, that the delicate balance of the realm required careful stewardship. In truth, Richard intended to take his nephew firmly under his own protection, consolidating his hold on power in the process. Thus, Edward V's path to the throne immediately turned into a struggle between two rival factions, the ambitious Woodvilles and Richard of Gloucester. For the young king, authority remained purely symbolic. The real power would fall to whichever side prevailed. Edward's journey toward London soon became the turning point of his fate. At Stony Stratford, he was met by his uncle Richard. But this was no family reunion, it was the opening move of a political coup. Richard had the leading Woodville men arrested. Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, the Queen's brother, and Richard Grey, Edward Fee's half-brother, were taken into custody. This decisive act struck directly at the heart of Woodville influence at court. The young king himself was escorted to the Tower of London, ostensibly for his own safety. Yet to contemporaries, this looked less like protection and more like imprisonment. Londoners soon realised that their boy king had not yet been crowned, but was instead being kept behind walls, hidden from public view. On the 13th of June 1483, another shock followed. Richard suddenly accused Lord Hastings, one of Edward IV's most loyal counsellors, of treason and had him executed on the spot. Hastings' death revealed just how far Richard was prepared to go in his pursuit of power. Few remained who could openly oppose him. Richard's next step was even bolder. He attacked the legitimacy of his nephews. He claimed that Edward IV had been pre-contracted to another woman before marrying Elizabeth Woodville, rendering that marriage invalid. By this logic, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, were declared illegitimate. Though the evidence was flimsy, the climate of fear Richard had created ensured the claim's acceptance. On 26th of June 1483, a council resembling Parliament declared that Edward V could not inherit the throne. In one of the most controversial successions in English history, Richard seized the crown for himself, becoming Richard III. The two boys, Edward V and his brother, remained confined within the Tower. In the early weeks of Richard's reign, the princes were still occasionally glimpsed, playing in the Tower's yard or peering from windows. But as the summer of 1483 wore on, such sightings became fewer. By autumn, the princes had vanished altogether. The greatest mystery of the age was the fate of the two boys. No one knew for certain where they had been taken or what had become of them. Yet the prevailing belief was that Richard III had them eliminated to secure his own throne. This suspicion, used as political propaganda by his enemies, soon became widely accepted among the public. No definitive proof ever emerged. But in 1674, during renovations at the Tower of London, workmen uncovered the skeletons of two children. These remains were believed to belong to the missing princes, and ever since, they have been linked to their story. Modern scientific analysis has been unable to confirm their identity with certainty, but the discovery reinforced the long-standing belief that the princes were indeed murdered within the Tower. The disappearance of the princes cast a permanent shadow over Richard's reign. Even though their deaths were never proven, the belief that Richard had killed his own nephews branded him as a cruel and untrustworthy monarch. In the eyes of many, he was not merely a usurper, but a tyrant who had committed the ultimate crime against his own blood. This scandal damaged more than Richard's personal reputation. It shook the very legitimacy of his rule. The mystery of the princes in the Tower would remain one of the most enduring enigmas of English history, ensuring that Richard's name would forever be shrouded in controversy. Only months after Richard's seizure of the crown, the kingdom was plunged into fresh turmoil. This time, the challenge came from his former ally, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. Once one of Richard's most powerful supporters after the fall of Warwick and Clarence, Buckingham had risen in prominence under the new king. Yet their alliance soon fractured. Some historians argue that Buckingham felt underappreciated by Richard. Others believe he was horrified by the disappearance of the princes and the king's increasingly ruthless image. What made the rebellion remarkable was the unlikely coalition it forged. Disaffected Yorkists, angered by Richard's usurpation, found common cause with the remnants of the Lancastrian cause. Both groups rallied behind a new figurehead, the young Henry Tudor, living in exile in France. The aim was bold: to depose Richard and place Henry Tudor on the throne. The plan was ambitious but fragile. Tudor was to sail from France and land in England, while Buckingham's forces rose in rebellion within the kingdom. But fate intervened. As Tudor attempted to cross the Channel, a violent storm scattered his fleet. Forced to turn back, he never reached English soil. Meanwhile, Buckingham's rebellion collapsed in isolation. The Duke tried to raise support in Wales, but his following dwindled. Richard's forces closed in quickly, and Buckingham was captured. Soon after, he was executed as the leader of the failed revolt. Though crushed, the Buckingham Rebellion had one lasting consequence. It introduced Henry Tudor as a serious contender for the throne. The suppression of Buckingham's uprising gave Richard III a brief reprieve, But by 1484, the weight of suspicion and rumour was heavier than ever. The whispers spread during the rebellion, particularly concerning the vanished princes, gnawed at Richard's legitimacy. To counter these doubts, Richard took a drastic step. He pushed through the act known as Titulus Regius. This statute declared Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid, claiming that Edward had been pre-contracted to another woman before marrying her. As a result, all of Edward's children, including Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were officially branded illegitimate. In law, this stripped the princes of any claim to the throne and reinforced Richard's own title. Yet in practice, it entrenched his feud with the Woodville family and was widely perceived as a grave injustice by the public. What truly shook Richard's reign, however, were the tragedies within his own household. In April 1484, his only son and heir, Edward of Middleham, died at a young age. The loss was devastating for Richard both emotionally and politically. With his heir gone, the future of the York dynasty fell into uncertainty. For a medieval monarch, an heir was not merely the continuation of the bloodline, it was the very foundation of legitimacy and security. Richard had lost that assurance in an instant. Another blow deepened the king's isolation in early 1485. Richard's wife, Anne Neville, daughter of Warwick the Kingmaker and once heir to his powerful legacy, died at a young age. Contemporary chroniclers noted that her health had long been fragile, but rumours spread quickly. Some claimed Richard had poisoned her. Though completely unproven, the accusation stained his reputation further. With Anne's death, gossip shifted in a new and dangerous direction. It was whispered that Richard planned to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. Such a union between uncle and niece would have been a scandal of immense proportions. The English nobility and the church alike reacted with unease to the very idea. By 1485, Richard III stood increasingly alone. He had lost his only child, his wife, and many of his closest allies. He was now a king with no heir. The confidence and determination that had marked the first months of his rule gave way to insecurity and suspicion. At court, whispers of fresh uprisings grew louder, and across the Channel, in France, Henry Tudor was gathering support, emerging as the new hope of Richard's enemies. Richard remained king in name, seemingly at the height of his power. Yet beneath the surface, his dynasty was collapsing, and his reign had become fatally fragile. In the summer of 1485, England, weary from decades of civil war, was once again drawn to a decisive turning point. Richard III, the last king of the House of York, sought to tighten his grip on the throne through harsh measures. While in exile, a young Lancastrian claimant was making his return step by step. Henry Tudor. Henry had spent much of his childhood in Wales and later endured many years of exile in France. His claim to the throne did not come directly from the Lancastrian line. Rather, it was through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, that he possessed royal blood. Yet, despite this tenuous link, Henry had become the sole surviving hope of the Lancastrian cause. Charles VIII of France, successor to Louis XI, saw in Henry an opportunity to weaken England and offered him financial support. With a small but disciplined force of roughly 2,000 men, Henry sailed from France and landed on the Welsh coast on the 7th of August, 1485. At first glance, the venture seemed perilous. Richard held the crown, and his army was far larger than Henry's. But Henry's greatest advantage lay in the ground he set foot on. In Wales, he could draw upon old loyalties and deep-rooted ties. Local supporters and Lancastrian loyalists began to rally to his banner. More importantly, although they avoided open commitment, the powerful Stanley family signalled their sympathy for Henry. Thomas Stanley and his brother William commanded forces so large that they could tip the balance of the coming conflict. Henry's march was slow but steady. Advancing from Wales into the heart of England, his army swelled with each mile as more men joined his cause. He was no longer merely a prince in exile, but a genuine contender for the throne. Richard, watching these developments with growing alarm, acted swiftly. He gathered his army and positioned it near Leicester, securing the strategic heights around Bosworth. His forces numbered between 10,000 and 12,000 men, giving him a clear numerical advantage. Yet much of his host was made up of levies called unwillingly to arms, and his confidence rested uneasily on the loyalty of his allies. By his side stood the Duke of Norfolk and the Earl of Northumberland, stalwart supporters of the crown. Richard deployed his army in the traditional three-battle formation, the centre under his own command, with heavy cavalry beneath the royal standard. The right wing, commanded by the Duke of Norfolk, composed largely of infantry. The left wing, under the Earl of Northumberland, a powerful force capable of deciding the day. Richard's strategy was to crush Henry's smaller host with a swift and decisive blow. Henry, for his part, had gathered around 5,000 to 6,000 men during his march from Wales, far fewer than Richard's. His core strength lay in seasoned French mercenaries and skilled Welsh archers, supplemented by Lancastrian loyalists who had joined along the way. The key uncertainty lay with the Stanleys. Thomas and William Stanley arrived on the battlefield with nearly 6,000 men of their own. But at first they held back, committing to neither side. For Richard, the Stanleys' hesitation was deeply troubling. For Henry, it was a source of hope. As the morning mist lifted, the battle began. Richard's army charged downhill, using the advantage of the high ground. Norfolk's wing clashed fiercely with Henry's vanguard. The fighting was intense, but Henry's disciplined French soldiers and Welsh archers managed to withstand Richard's first assault. Northumberland's wing, however, scarcely moved. The reason remains debated to this day. Some historians argue that Northumberland deliberately held back, verging on treachery, while others suggest that the chaos of the battlefield prevented him from receiving clear orders. What is certain is that a significant portion of Richard's army never engaged. As the battle raged on, Richard spotted a weakness. Henry's position was guarded by only a thin ring of men. Believing he could decide the conflict in a single stroke, Richard made the choice later described as the most courageous yet the most desperate charge in English history. Leading a company of his household knights, Richard spurred his horse forward. His aim was simple: to kill or capture Henry and end the rebellion at once. At first, the charge achieved its purpose. Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, was struck down and killed. Some of Henry's men broke under the ferocity of the king's attack. But at this critical moment, the Stanleys finally chose their side. William Stanley's forces surged forward, crashing into Richard's cavalry. Surrounded, Richard refused to retreat. Chroniclers tell us he fought bravely to the very end, his horse mired in a bog, striking blows as he tried desperately to reach Henry himself. But he was overwhelmed and slain in the struggle. Richard III thus became the last English king to die in battle. After the fight, his body was carried to Leicester, stripped naked, and displayed ignominiously on horseback before the townspeople. It was not only the tragic end of a king, but also the collapse of the House of York itself. On the battlefield, the victors hailed Henry as their new monarch. Legend has it that Richard's crown was retrieved from the ground and placed upon Henry's head. In that moment, the Tudor dynasty was born. Bosworth was more than a battle between two armies. It was the reckoning of two dynasties. Richard's bold but doomed charge entered legend, while the intervention of the Stanleys changed the course of the war and the future of England forever. The consequences were clear. The House of York was extinguished, and the Wars of the Roses came to their bloody conclusion. Henry Tudor was proclaimed King Henry VII, the first monarch of a new dynasty. Henry's greatest achievement came not through battle, but through politics. Soon after his coronation, he married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York. This marriage symbolised the end of nearly half a century of civil strife. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were fused into the red and white Tudor rose. This union represented not just the birth of a new dynasty, but the dawn of a new England. The Tudors would build a strong central monarchy, restore stability, and guide the kingdom toward renewed prominence in Europe. History would forever remember Richard III as the last English king to fall on the battlefield, and Henry VII as the founder of the Tudor dynasty, the ruler who led England into a new era. And so we conclude, the Wars of the Roses were never merely a struggle for a crown. They were a crucible that reshaped the destiny of England itself. At Bosworth Field, with blood and steel, a new chapter began.